think I would like to set process philosophy, process cosmology, in a very brief survey of what has happened to Western cosmology. My view is that Western cosmology has collapsed. It is not taught in universities. The closest that we get is some cosmology by scientists who try to distinguish between science and philosophy, but I think very often the boundary gets confused. And since cosmology should be dealing with more than simply the physical knowledge of the cosmos, I don't think this is really cosmology in the full sense. So very briefly, Westerners were clearly cosmological thinkers as late as Descartes. But Descartes started off modern cosmology on what I believe to be an unsustainable course. He founded it on a radical dualism, as is, I think, known by all of you. He took for granted that there were subjects, but the only subjects he recognized were human subjects. And everything else is an object. And science studies only objects as objects. And that's the only knowledge of things that we need or can have. Now, that worked fairly well until evolution came along. But when we accepted the view that human beings have evolved in the natural world, not out of the natural world, but in natural processes and are fully part of nature, then dualism became impossible. Now, still, most Westerners think in dualistic terms, but they don't dare to articulate it that way because it contradicts what we know about human beings. Now, the way in which most people responded was to follow Immanuel Kant. Kant had developed a dualism that was not an ontological or metaphysical dualism, not really a cosmological dualism, but an epistemological or methodological dualism. So if you want to know what is, the only way to do it is in terms of the Cartesian cosmology so far as nature is concerned. And that means even with respect to human beings, the only thing that is truly knowledge about human beings is of human beings on the model of machines. We just had, I happened to get in time for a lecture that spent some time on that, so I won't elaborate at all. I think that was very well done. So on the one hand, we have the only thing we could really call a cosmology now is a monism that is completely mechanical and that has only objects. It is impossible to deny that there are subjects, but at least in the United States, I think in Western Europe, the scientific assumption, cosmological assumption, is that subjectivity is, the technical term is epiphenomenal. Let's just put it in another way and say that subjects have no causal efficacy. Their occurrence makes no difference in the world. What happens subjectively is not included in the reality of the world as studied by science. So this is the victory of complete objectification of the world in terms of cosmological thought. Now, the people who teach that do not believe it. No one really believes that he or she is a zombie. But that is the systematic implication. Now, the last refuge of subjective thought under this pressure of the objective is human experience. But the assignment of the neuroscientists is to show that everything in human experience can be explained by a sufficient knowledge of the brain. I should say what I'm sure many of you know, there has been no success. Of course, one can show correlations, but many neuroscientists have actually discovered that subjective experience, they tend to specialize on Buddhist meditation, can actually change the size and shape of the brain. So that instead of proving that everything is explained objectively, the evidence is that the subjective plays a considerable role. Now, of course, that evidence for that has been around for a long time, but it has been easier to ignore it than it is becoming now. I do not think a cosmology that says there is nothing but objects can survive the evidence. And scientists still claim to pay attention to evidence. I think sometimes they will not look at evidence that doesn't fit their model. So I'm not, like all of us pretend to do something and don't quite do it. I'm not saying scientists are worse than others. I'm simply saying they also claim to just examine the evidence and tell us what it shows, but there's an awful lot of evidence they will not look at because they cannot integrate it. And even in this evidence that they do pay attention to, and that does not fit the model that is derived from the objective, I'm referring to the quantum world. They, of course, take the quantum world seriously, but they take it and call it anomalous, and they separate it. For the most part, the rest of science is taught the same way it was taught before we discovered that the most fundamental elements in the world don't fit the same model that is used in the rest of science. I'm trying to say, first, philosophically, cosmology broke down, and since Kant, those who follow Kant have no place for cosmology. So the great majority of philosophers will not deal with cosmology. The people who do deal with cosmology are generally operating outside of academia. And fortunately, there are people who do that. Now, there was another possibility at the time we discovered that human beings are part of nature. And there was a generation of philosophers in the West who said, now that we realize and that means also our most intimate and personal experience, a part of nature, that nature is not what Descartes said nature was. Nature includes subjectivity as well as objectivity. Once one really accepts that, one can create a new cosmology. And there were several people who did develop cosmologies that were consistent with the scientific evidence of that time. Now, I belong to that segment of that effort that looks especially to Whitehead. We are very close cousins of the people who look to Bernstein. I think these were the two major cosmological thinkers who responded to the evolutionary theory by developing a different view of nature. Now, the nature that we need to understand if we have this assignment is a nature in which everything is ultimately, I won't say, well, let me say everything is really a subject. Now, what is a subject? A subject, the word subject in English, and whether in translations all of this meaning is communicated, I'm not sure. But we are subject to things. That means a subject is influenced by other things. Not casually or incidentally, but in its very constitution. To be a subject is to be shaped by the world, by the other. That which is not us becomes us. So we are subject to everything that has happened in the world. But a subject is also an agent. And an agent operates on other things. So that that which comes into being out of the world then contributes to the future of the world. But an agent is also not merely a transmitter of energy or of the forces of the past. An agent plays a role in its own constitution. Now, not everybody who talks about subjects has all of those dimensions in mind. But I believe when I say the world is made up of subjects, that's what I mean, and I think that's what many people mean. So, when we look at the quantum phenomena, we say they too are subjects. That does not mean they have conscious experience, but it means that every one of them comes into being out of other things. It is shaped by, informed by the world into which it comes into being. And it transmits to the future so that other subjects receiving are also transmitters. But what we understand about the quanta is that the world they come out of does not strictly determine exactly what they become. So I think they are agents in the full sense of what I'm speaking. Now, a philosopher a thinker in the Teilhard tradition, which is part of the Bergsonian tradition, is Thomas Berry, and I very much like his sweeping statement about cosmology. The cosmos is not a collection of objects, it is a communion of subjects. Now, communion is a fairly fancy word for what we might find among some of these subjects, but it simply means being with each other in a community. That is, every entity in the world is what it is because of other entities. And therefore, when we try to understand our sense that the world about us is more than simply our objects. The Gaia hypothesis, of course, lies in this direction. Animism is a very strong form of this sense. The sensibility that shapes these ideas is right. My experience is part of my whole psychophysical being, and it is shaped by everything else that is happening in my body. I am in communion with all the cells in my body, not just the neurons in my brain, But to be in communion with them doesn't mean that I am totally determined by them. But whatever I do affects them. Whatever they do affects me. And my body is in communion with all the other bodies around it. Now, if the world is made up of subjects, the next question is, well, exactly what are the subjects that surround us? Is this table a subject? Well, my judgment is that it is not. It is a collection of subjects. There is no separate subjectivity, no separate agency in the table. Whitehead, this is one area in which I am not satisfied with my philosophical mentor. Whitehead would locate the subjects only at the level of the quanta, or at least in his examples it was usually the electrons and protons and neutrons. The philosophy of his time was just beginning to think in terms of the quanta. I think that at the level of the molecule there is a subjectivity. I think certainly at the level of cells, now there are no cells in the table, so that doesn't apply. Certainly with unicellular organisms, they seem to me to have all the characteristics that I have described. But the many difficult questions about cosmology arise when we try to decide exactly how this can fit with what we know about the universe. But I believe that within another generation we will have a science that takes the subjectivity of the things it studies into account in a way that has been profoundly resisted since the rejection of Aristotelianism. And I think when that happens, we will have a far more adequate cosmology, and I do not think it will really have exactly, even the scientific aspects of it will be exactly as they are today. I think that there is so much influence, even at a distance, the kinds of things that have been studied in parapsychology and that are systematically excluded by mainline studies, that participate in shaping things. I will give one example that is significant to me in showing how the prejudice against subjects leads to mistakes in science. I'll do this simply in terms of the evolutionary theory. I happen to be very appreciative of Charles Darwin, but I think neo-Darwinism, which is the orthodox and standard teaching of Darwinism in our universities, has made serious factual mistakes by refusing to include evidence. This can be argued at many levels. Lynn Margulis, I believe, was featured here in connection with the Gaia hypothesis, with which she was certainly sympathetic. But her emphasis was on non-genetic ways in which evolution has been affected. And when she came out with the view that the living cell is a product of one bacteria swallowing another one but not digesting it, she was ridiculed, because that's very different from the notion of random mutation. But eventually, biologists have accepted that. Now she thinks, or she thought she had died, but she thought that a good many developments in evolution, also in the human body and so forth, are the result of bacterial activity. and the effect of the bacterial activity upon the human body that are simply ignored in the general course of evolutionary teaching. I'd like to point out to biologists that there are times when animals or any kind of living thing, I'll take animals as the example, or birds, that they respond to new environmental challenges in ways that require rational intelligence. If one bird picks up a straw in a species that has not previously had this kind of activity, and it succeeds in getting a worm out of a hole in a tree, very quickly other birds of the same species will follow suit. Now, this is a case of an intelligent action on the part of animals having an effect upon the evolutionary history. Because once this new behavior is important and successful, it is natural that the beak will change in such a way as to be more suitable for this kind of behavior. I think biologists all recognize that. I brought up this example in talking to my friends who teach evolutionary biology, and they will say yes. But the next time they explain how evolution takes place, it does not mention anything